This is the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research about humanity more accessible to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions about who we are. I'm your host, Valerie Hansen, and today we're going to try to trace the origins of globalization. So when did globalization begin? Perhaps in the 1970s, you might say, with the rise of air travel, modern communications, and global supply chains. Perhaps earlier, with European empires on which the sun never set. My guest today thinks that the roots go even deeper. Yale historian Valerie Hansen is the author of one of my favorite history books from the past years, a book titled The Year 1000. And Hansen's argument is that a lot of fascinating stories about the origins of globalization really coalesce around the middle of the medieval period, around the year 1000. And that, for whatever reason, perhaps because the global population had reached some kind of a tipping point, but for whatever reason, people began moving around more and more around this time. And whether it was explorers moving, whether it was merchants moving, a lot of interconnections, a lot of interesting links started forming that pushed the world towards the directions with where we are so clearly walking on today. So what exactly was going on? Well, in this episode, we talk about Vikings in North America. We talk about Polynesians reaching distant islands across the Pacific, perhaps going even further than that. We also discuss great trade networks, the famous Silk Road, not only from China to Venice, but also in Africa. We talk about also the Amber Road. We talk about the Maritime Silk Road, the Indian Ocean. And towards the end, we also talk about how this was not just people moving more, how this was not just objects moving more, about how this was also about ideas moving around the world. Not only ideas behind inventions that built modernity later, such as paper, but also ideas about God, about life and death. The origins of the world religions is also on the agenda today, so there is a lot in this episode. And towards the end, as always, I ask my guest what all of this tells her about humanity. And I was really delighted I could not foresee Hansen's response. So it's really worth sticking with us until the very end. I hope that you enjoy this. If you are new to the show, great to have you here, and you can of course subscribe to On Humans for more of these conversations with world-leading scholars around the story of our curious species. And if you're a returning listener who likes this and wants to support this work a little bit, you can do so for free by just giving the show a nice review on whatever app you are using, or by sharing it on whatever channels you think your friends, colleagues, or others might find it. Thank you so much for considering that, and especially thank you so much to all the wonderful people who support this work at patreon.com/onhumans. This episode, as always, is dedicated to you. And now let's begin with Valerie Hansen. Professor Valerie Hansen, welcome to On Humans.
Thank you so much, Hilary. It's very nice to be here.
The topic we will discuss today is globalization, the deep roots of globalization. Now, let's first just start thinking about what happened maybe around year 1000 that you think makes it a useful way to think about the origins of our globalized world.
I'm very glad you said origins, because I want to stress that I'm not talking about the 1970s. We're all pretty clear about what globalization was like in the 1970s. I'm interested in the beginnings. And the phenomenon I'm interested in is people and goods and ideas moving maybe not all the way around the world, but longer distances than they had before. And I think one of the questions is on everybody's mind would be like, why the year 1000? And I should tell you, there are people who've argued for globalization in 3000 BC. You know, that they see lapis lazuli from Pakistan in Mesopotamia and say, okay, you know, there's regional trade. And I agree, certainly is going on. And certainly with the Roman Empire is going on more than even regional trade. But the year 1000 is, I think, when you can make a case that the whole world is involved. And so that's my logic for focusing on the year 1000.
And I guess the whole world being involved very much here hinges on a fact that I think a lot of listeners will know, maybe some don't know, but we often at least don't really think about when we think about the Americas and crossing the Atlantic. We often think about Columbus and people after him crossing in the late 1400s. But that was not the first time that the Atlantic was crossed from the European side to the Americas. So maybe you can give a brief introduction to what happened around year 1000, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page.
Well, I think you're specifically thinking of the Vikings who leave. I mean, it's funny, in the late 900s are based in Scandinavia, and then Eric the Red is exiled from Denmark to Iceland and then exiled again to Greenland. And there's someone who's not related to him who goes to Greenland and wants to join him as one of his followers. This guy named Bjarni Herjolfsson, he is blown off course on his way to Greenland from Iceland and sees three places that scholars now have identified as being in Canada, the east coast of Canada, and then the east coast of Maine.
Maine. Okay, so US.
Right. Well, in Boston, you could see a plaque that identifies right next to the Charles River, a plaque saying the Vikings were here.
Oh, in Boston.
And
Oh, I did not know that.
that's not true. I would say that the evidence for that, I hate to say it's not true because there's always a chance we'll have new evidence, but the archaeological evidence for the Vikings visiting North America is conclusive for the island of Newfoundland, and that's in north of Nova Scotia and a little bit east of Prince Edward Island. So that's one example of a body of water that is probably crossed for the first time. I don't want to say, we don't always know who crossed it. And there's like a legend about St. Brendan from Ireland crossing, and maybe so. We just, there's just no evidence of it.
Let's stay with Vikings for a moment. I mean, I knew that the Vikings had crossed. That was something I learned, in history books when I was young. I don't think that's very controversial. However, it always felt like, well, they went, they came back, nothing really happened. They didn't really do anything in America. And I feel like you're not saying that they were doing what the Spanish would do years later, but there was a presence. People did stay there. They left marks that we can now read.
That's true. The archaeological evidence we have for them in this archaeological site is called Lansaw Meadows. It's at the northern tip of Newfoundland, and they probably were there for about a decade. So that's hard to argue for historic significance. But I think what's more interesting is the possibility they go back to Greenland and then they keep coming back to North America, probably periodically, to pick up lumber.
Yes, so I think the lumber is interesting because that is economic activity across the ocean.
And then also there's interesting evidence about furs. I think some of the story of the year 1000, especially for the places where so much hinges on archaeology, is new archaeological techniques that allow us, for example, to identify the kind of furs that were found in Greenland, and that some of the fur, if I remember correctly, it's bison fur, but anyway, whatever it is, it's an animal that is from North America and doesn't exist on Greenland. And we know from these later, the Viking sagas that were written in Old Norse and written down several centuries after the events that they purport to describe, that there was trade, that the local people in North America, and it's debated who it was that the Vikings actually encountered, that they had furs that they were trading. So there's a massive fur trade across all of North America. And when Jacques Cartier comes, he has an encounter with the local people who, by that time, we know who they are. It's the Micmac. And the very first thing they do is try to trade furs with the French. So anyway, I think that's interesting about the people living in Greenland not having lumber, and even in Iceland, not having enough lumber, and then sourcing it from North America.
And they did go further south than I had realized. And we don't know how far south they went, but you even make the point that they might have went much further south than is typically thought.
Oh, yes, it's in the book. I raised the possibility without saying that this happened, because I'll say it's the part of the book that got the most blowback, the most negative reaction, is that there are some. So the Mayan capital the Maya were never united. It was always a conglomeration of city states. But the largest city state around the year 1000 is in a place called Chichen Itza, which is on the Yucatan Peninsula, about modern day Mexico. And people, I mean, it's on a lot of people's bucket list. If you Google Chichen Itza at the equinox, you'll see movies of the sun rising and forming a snake on the staircases leading up a pyramid. But near that pyramid is a large building called the Temple of the Warriors that you're not now allowed to go into. But in the 1920s and 30s, American researchers went into these buildings, and there were a lot of wall murals that had collapsed and were on the ground in fragments, and an American team copied them. And they show some people with blonde hair, and is I would say, a small contingent of people, including one of my late colleagues, a man named Mike Coe, who believes that those are pictures of the Vikings. Mike Coe believes that those are pictures of the Vikings, and this also Mary Miller, who used to be at Yale and is now at the Getty Research Institute. She also believes that. There's a lot of arguments back and forth about whether or not these blonde-haired people were Vikings. There are also some paintings that show boats, and Mike Coe thought those were more conclusive because the boats are made out of planks that are nailed together, and that's not how the Maya made their own boats. So they appear to be a different, an imported boat, maybe a captured boat. And so I would say that there's right now the possibility that the Vikings got there without anything being conclusive.
And I think that why it doesn't, to me, that it doesn't strike as such a weird claim is that the ocean currents make it quite probable that they just got blew off course. It was one or two boats, they got blew off course, which happens all the time. One of them was captured by the Mayas. Something happened. Someone makes a painting, whatever. I mean, none of that strikes me as like, well, that is the weirdest thing that has ever happened in history. How could that be possibly true? So
right, the ocean currents was interesting about how the way that the waters move around the Atlantic, the ocean waters move around the Atlantic. You could be pushed from Scandinavia to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico.
yeah, but let's make sure that no listener goes away and says Valerie Hansen believes that the Vikings definitely were in Mexico. They might have been in Mexico. We have some evidence. Is that the right way of saying it, or what level of how should we frame this carefully?
I one time was teaching and gave the students an exam where I gave them propositions and I said, is this, certain, plausible, or possible? And I would say it's possible.
Possible.
That would be my category.
Yeah. Very good.
And,
very good.
People, I would just say for the reaction to the book, some people just felt that saying that was tantamount to saying that Martians had built the Great Wall.
Yeah, that's the reaction that I didn't really understand, especially given having read the book and having seen the care. But anyway, we're not here to discuss those details. We're here to discuss the big picture. And I think that there is an interesting way in which there is a plausible way in which something very, very weird, and which was very long time a completely fringe proposition, seems to have happened on the other side, not in the Atlantic, but in the Pacific. I don't know. Have you followed the genetic evidence about Polynesians and Native Americans mixing?
Yeah, I am skeptical.
You're skeptical. Okay, so I interviewed a Mexican geneticist for the show who run the studies in Rapa Nui, and he, I mean, they don't know when it happened, but they say that it's in the genetic sense, it's absolutely clear that it did happen.
There's some mixing, but I was my understanding. And I haven't looked at the latest information, and the person you're interviewing is working on this, so he's going to be more up to date than me. But when I was looking at it, so this is before 2020, the late 20 teens, that one of the questions I had was about whether the skeletons were historic skeletons. To be really convincing, the skeletons would have to be pre-1492 skeletons.
Yeah. So the research that Andres Moreno Estrada, who I interviewed, he's done has come later. And they haven't worked with historical skeletons, but they work with modern day population genetics.
Right.
And they date backwards. They basically they look at signals, and of course there are all sorts of signals in modern day genetics.
Right.
But then they date, like, in this population, how long has this signal been? And you don't get a year, but you get a rough time scale. And he said that it is absolutely clear that it is pre-Columbus. There is a signal from the Native Americans in the Easter Island populations, and that we don't know how it got there, but it was there. But it's interesting that you're skeptical. Yeah, and we don't need to solve that in this conversation.
Right. The only other thing I would just add to that about the Polynesian question is all of the background. I mean, it's a theory where there's been a lot of people would like to think it's true.
Yes. And a lot of people think that it's like saying the Martians built the pyramids.
Right.
But that's why I personally thought the genetics was so interesting, because there is there are certain kind of how would I say, it's hard to just deny a genetic signal if it's well researched.
I'll just say one thing, which is, as a historian reading some genetic research, I'm not saying this is true of all genetic research, I feel sometimes the geneticists are so convinced by their own evidence that they're not looking at the other historic evidence we have.
But would we have any historical evidence against that proposition?
Well, for example, the currents and how hard it is to go in, it's easy to go in one direction, but much harder to go in the other. So it's hard to go from Latin America to Easter Island, right? I mean, Thor Heyerdahl, that's what he wanted to do, and from Ecuador to Easter Island, and then his rafts were towed till they got about, I don't know, 50 miles, 100 miles off the coast of Ecuador, and then you could let them go because there are currents pushing you boats back into the water. It's I think possible is good for right now.
Very good. Okay.
I was going to say for certain. I mean, certain is just the movement of the Polynesians in the Pacific.
Yes, exactly.
The dating of their voyages is contested, but one chronology has people moving in the Pacific Triangle. So that's, am I going to get this right? Hawaii, Polynesia, and New Zealand. So they're sailing there.
Around year 1000, you say?
Around the year 1000.
Because they started much before, but so interesting. So around year 1000, they're getting into these remote places.
Yeah, the chronology I think that's most persuasive is that they're getting there around 1290, and so a little bit after the year 1000. And it seems like there was some kind of collapse that pushed everybody to leave Polynesia, maybe in all directions, and then they just land where there is land for them to go to. So that puts them in Hawaii and New Zealand.
So we have the Polynesians have been moving for a very long time, but now they are moving not necessarily yet at all of these kind of end points, but getting towards them around year 1000. The Vikings moved to the Americas. So clearly the adventurers, the explorers, they are there, they are doing their thing.
Right.
If we zoom in then into the more densely populated regions of the old world, if we want to use that term, if we look at trade, I loved the anecdote that there is a tomb in Beijing or close to Beijing where from around this time where they found amber, which was traced from the Baltics. I mean, I'm from Finland. I was born on the shores of the Baltic Sea, and I've lived in Beijing. So I just love that anecdote. People talk about the Amber Road, and that the Sung dynasty is the main dynasty in China from 960 to 1276. But in the area specifically of Beijing, there's a small dynasty, the Liao, and they really had a taste for amber. And so, and they were importing amber from the Baltic. So I would put that in the category of certain. And how did the amber get there? What do we know about it? We don't know for sure, but do we know what is the Amber Road? Why do they even want the amber? What would be a quick introduction into the story that one tomb is a symbol of? Well, it's the Liao dynasty have, I would just say, an affection for beads of different types and different kinds of jewels. They're Buddhists, and so one of the things they do is
make offerings, large numbers of bead offerings to the Buddha, bury them in pagodas. And in terms of the trade, the products of the North are the Norse are trading. So we're back to the Norse, right? We've come full circle. The Norse are based in Scandinavia, and there's a major trade artery between them and the Abbasid Caliphate, which is based in the capitals in Baghdad.
Aha.
And the Norse trade goods are amber, it's not their main trade good, furs, and then slaves.
Hmm.
And then going in the opposite direction is money, a lot of silver. And so there are huge hoards of silver coins, that have Arabic writing on them, that have been found in different East European and Northern Europe, the Scandinavian countries. And the once the amber gets to the Abbasid Caliphate, then we just need to have trade between the Abbasid Caliphate and the Liao dynasty to get the amber to China.
And that's either the overland Silk Road or the maritime shipping. Could it be?
No, it'll be overland trade.
Overland. Okay, so this would be the classic camel caravans.
There's something I was going to say, going through not ocean trade, but there's some river trade, like going through Eastern Europe. There would be smaller boats going on the major river arteries. Eastern Europe tends to be kind of flat, and you can travel, I think, a pretty good distance in a wooden boat, like a Viking boat, and then carry the boat a small distance and get on the next river.
It's incredible. Yeah, I mean, first you row, then you carry, then you row. And it really does sound like an athletic competition, but for them it was very real business. And unfortunately, like you said, sometimes very, very brutal, violent business, trading humans. I mean, the very word slave comes from the word Slav. Is that part of this story?
That is part of this story. And also that we have some observers writing in Arabic saying about the Norse or the Slavs is that they capture their people and sell them as slaves.
But that's similar to what's happened a lot for example, I mean, isn't that part of the African slave trade later on also, is that it's...
I mean, I'm sorry to be so negative. I just think it's the whole story of the whole world. Is that the slave trade is incredibly important in an era when there's, no mechanical devices.
How much bigger are the differences? Because, like you said, we find it around the world. Do we find it in equal amounts? I mean, there's a lot of Chinese historians who say that it was a significantly smaller part of the Chinese economy in history. You're a China expert by your training. What do you think about was slavery something that was much more pronounced in the western parts of Eurasia?
I wouldn't say that. I think there's a shift in Europe from basically slaves to serfs, in Western Europe, and we see a very similar shift in China.
And the difference, just to make sure we're on the same page, the difference is that you cannot sell a serf away. The serf is there in the land, but then you can treat them badly if you're the landlord.
You could treat them badly, but and also they're tied to the land. And basically the Chinese government in the Song dynasty kind of creates a tax advantage where it's better to have serfs than to have slaves. So historians of slavery don't always talk about, they don't use the word slavery, right? I think that now they use the words enslavement and enslaved, but also just like a range from unfree to free. And so the serfs might be slightly less unfree than the enslaved are, but they're not free.
They're not free. Yeah. But very briefly, what about the China historians who say that actually even serfdom was much more... I mean, serfdom was very common in Eastern Europe for a very long time. And there are Chinese historians who say that China was actually more like Western Europe, where it was more free, tax-paying peasants.
There's a lot of regional variation in China, so that in densely populated rice-growing areas, slavery doesn't exist in those areas. There's a lot more commercial relations and laborers working using contracts and on temporary contracts because there's no shortage of labor. Then when you get to less populated parts of China, like in the north where they're not growing rice, they're growing wheat, their population is much lower. And then landlords have to figure out a way to keep people on the land. And that's where you tend to see either more slavery or more serfdom.
Oh, that's so interesting because I recently interviewed Kenneth Pomeranz, the author of Great Divergence,
Uh-huh.
and his whole thing when he makes his massive comparison of like what place could have had the Industrial Revolution. He compares Europe to China, and he picks those kind of, especially the Yangtze River Delta, but more
Yeah.
generally the southern, more populated regions as the places that are more like, say, Britain in Europe, whereas the
Right.
northern western parts are more like, say, Eastern Europe.
Right.
And that chimes actually very well with what you just said. So the southern rice growing regions, they look a little bit more like England, where you work for a pay and then maybe you're unemployed and you're sad. But
And you can leave. I mean, you're not bound to the land. You can go be somebody else's tenant.
that's so interesting. Well, hey, let's zoom back into the big picture. When thinking of the link between the amber has gotten with the Vikings or the Norse or however we call them, in a ship that might have had also human trafficking going on at the same time, it comes to the Islamic world, and then you said it goes overland to the Liao. A lot of things that went east did not go overland. A lot would go to the Indian Ocean, which was this kind of highway of trade in that time. If we try to imagine this kind of early globalization, I think a lot of people would say Indian Ocean is where it's most kind of day-to-day part of life. Do you think that's right?
Yes, I think that's true.
What did it look like?
Well, I mean, I'm working on this now. I would say in different periods, it looks different. There's no surprise any historian would expect that. But by 400, we have Chinese monks describing their voyages from China to India. And so we've got the Chinese ships, we have the Arab or Persian Gulf dhows, and then the third kind of ship are the Southeast Asian ships that are also made without nails. So dhows have no nails; they're stitched together, and then the Southeast Asian ships are called lashed lug vessels.
What do they carry?
The main thing going from China to, I mean, Southeast Asia and India and the Arab world is ceramics. And a lot of these shipwrecks are in the Java Sea. And one of the shipwrecks is found off a place in the Java Sea called Cirebon, is carrying, one of the excavators says 600,000 ceramic vessels. Other people think it's not that many. The vessels are all welded together, so it's very hard to count them. Maybe 300,000, but a huge number of ceramics. And that, I think the quantities really have surprised people. Also, a lot of metal. China's exporting metal. Some of the metal is in ingots, and other countries are using it to make coins. Some of it is in goods like mirrors or bronze woks that people are cooking with.
So a lot of these things are coming. What's going to China?
China is just has a huge appetite for aromatics. In Chinese, there's this word xiang. It's a catch-all term. It includes spices, so like cloves. So it's spices, smells and flavors, and fragrant woods, resins. And we know in terms of what people are consuming, the fabulously wealthy are building whole rooms out of these imported rare woods like sandalwood. And then Chinese medicine, drugs are all filled with these aromatics, imported aromatics. The Sung, so this is 960 to 1276, is a period where there's a huge growth in Chinese medicine, and we have thousands and thousands of prescriptions, and many of them are using these aromatics in the ingredients for those inscriptions. So it's, food, medicine, decorative things, if not a room built out of fragrant wood, a box is on the small side, or a table. These are all things that resins that people are burning, incense.
What about if we go to the opposite side of this kind of big web, the east, if we go all the way west on the Indian Ocean, we get to the east coast of Africa, to the Swahili coast.
Right.
If we imagine this kind of big global trade network, I guess the end point in the west wouldn't even be East Africa, but West Africa, like Mali, for example, where a lot of gold, at least later, I don't know yet, around year 1000, but you have these stories, the world's richest man
Right.
ever, Mansa Musa,
Right.
in the 1300s, and we have Chinese porcelain, we have Chinese silk in the archaeology in Mali. So I have, whenever I want to be annoying when talking about Silk Roads, I say that it's such a Eurocentric myth that it ended in Venice. It didn't end in Venice; it ended in Mali. So,
Well, I think UNESCO got there. I think they had a big Silk Road project where a chunk of the Silk Road was in
oh
Africa.
really? Oh, I'm so glad to hear actually. But what was going on in Africa in a very high overview? We have the West Africa that is bringing things, especially on these camel caravans up towards the Mediterranean. Then we have the East Coast where the boats are coming to this Indian Ocean trade. But what about the stuff? What are things that are coming to Africa? What are things that are leaving Africa? Gold, we already mentioned.
I mean, it's funny that we have a kind of catch-all term for things like things that are goods coming into Africa across the Mediterranean, and then they're carried overland to the towns on the northern edge of the Sahara, where they're then loaded onto caravans and carried across the Sahara. And I mean, one of the items that comes up all the time is beads, different kinds of beads.
Like glass beads or?
Glass beads, but also beads made out of other things. I mean, that sounds funny, but like made out of minerals, like carnelian beads. And so I think that's one of the things I think we all wish we knew more about.
Interesting.
Leaving Africa, we know that the slave trade, both on the East Africa and then also on North Africa.
Yeah, so this is way before the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, and there's very good work. There's one historian who did this work a while ago named Ralph Austin, who was trying to calculate the size of the pre-Atlantic slave trade and the trans-Saharan slave trade. And his calculations were that the total number of slaves um, forced across the Sahara or forced to East Africa and put on boats was equivalent to the number of slaves in the transatlantic. The difference was that the transatlantic slave trade was more concentrated into like 3 centuries, from 1500 to 1800.
Yes, yeah. There was also, I think, one difference was that in the Islamic world, not to give them too much of a credit when you're doing slavery, but I guess the one difference was that there was a lot of freeing of slaves, which was not the case in the Americas. At least I've noticed come up when doing this comparison of these two slave trades is that even if both were very brutal, that what made the American slave trade, I guess, particularly brutal was that there typically was no way out, whereas it was quite common to get high ranking positions and maybe even become free when you were shipped to the East. Do you think that's right?
Basically, I think it's right. I wouldn't say high ranking positions as much as a lot of the research on slavery has shown that in the Islamic world, there was a higher proportion of women enslavement, and that Islamic law encouraged male owners to free the mothers of their children, because the children born to an enslaved mother were Muslim and were not enslaved, and then to free their mothers, either the originally enslaved mothers, either at some point in their lives, or when the father died, that he would free them in his will. And that's part of the reason that Baghdad had such a huge appetite for the slaves, because so many of the enslaved didn't stay enslaved.
Yeah. But let's leave that very dark chapter aside and talk about happier things, including paper. One of the things that's traveling is not only cargo, but also things like paper from China. And I think that's something that it was very much around the time that I read your Year 1000. I also read William Dalrymple's book Golden Road, which was more of an Indian history, but with a very, very similar eye into these global connections. And I remember that kind of reading them together, I just really started appreciating how there were a lot of these building blocks of modernity that were on the move. Paper, but it wasn't just paper. It was also like numbers. Like the Indian idea of zero, of creating a number system that uses zero, is starting to really make its kind of making its move around year 1000. So I guess two questions. One is,
I was going to say so I just want to say for the record that the Maya also have zero. It's not a unique Indian invention.
Oh, interesting.
Um,
Okay,
they develop it. They develop it independently.
let's keep that
So
on the
sorry, I
record.
interrupted you. You had two questions. Yeah.
Yes, but thank you. Let's keep that on the record. Now, the two questions is, besides the Maya point, do you think that there is something right? Do you think that big picture is right in what I just said? And should we add something to that? If so, then besides paper and Indian mathematics or Indian Arabic mathematics.
Well, there's this famous Chinese inventions, right? That paper, the compass, gunpowder. What's the fourth?
Yeah, what is the fourth?
Mm. Printing, paper and printing.
Mm.
There are other things in China, like there's a movable rudder that you can, when you have a boat and it goes into a harbor, if you can lift the rudder up, the boat doesn't get stuck in the mud. Well, when I think about this, the main thing I'm thinking about is that you have all of these inventions are moving around so that they're not staying local. And so these kinds of inventions, they're starting in China, they're moving to the Islamic world, through the Islamic world, and then they're ending up in Europe. So rather than specific inventions, what I think is interesting is that you see this kind of movement of multiple kinds of inventions, often basically starting in China, going through the Islamic world, and getting to Europe.
I really like the idea of there are all these ways in which we imagine the world, the medieval period, for example, being a very classic one. And I think that putting this one, like this kind of turn of the millennia, year 1000, into being a new way of kind of slicing the cake. I think it's a very creative act, and I think that it's actually very useful in many ways. But maybe it would be good to backtrack a little bit and see how many of the how deep of a history do these things actually have, and how different was the year one 1,000 years before? Would it be right to say that things were not moving in the same way, from China to Europe back then? Or I mean, there are these stories about Roman ambassadors going to China, maybe, or one Roman ambassador maybe going to China, and Roman coins.
I think we're pretty sure that's a forgery, because the gifts he brings are typical Southeast Asian gifts, like rhinoceros horn. There are not very many rhinos in Rome. I think when you ask that question, if you were living in Rome in the year one, I think there's a lot of movement of peoples and objects, certainly from different parts of the Roman Empire. And, there's certainly, and there's been some archaeology recently about trade with the Indian coast, the South India. And there's extensive trade. The question is, if you're outside the Roman Empire, I think it's a better question. And in China in the year one, we have a big dynasty, the Han Dynasty, and it has trade. It has some knowledge with Central Asia, but most of the world, and I'm thinking about the Chinese in this category too, are divided into smaller regions, and most people are not having much contact with anyone outside of their home region. And I think that is changing. In the year 1000, not that many people are traveling themselves, but people who stay home are also affected. And I think that's one of the big differences, that wherever you are, well, there are some pockets where there isn't much trade, but let's say 80% of the world is exposed to foreign goods, people living on coastal ports, much more so than people on the interior. But even people on the interior are being exposed. So I think that's a major difference I would point to.
Another major difference that you point out is the question of religion. And that around year 1000, you start having what we call world religions being world religions. It's almost impossible to think of religious blocks in year zero or year one.
Year one is hard.
Year one is hard.
Unless you think about like the Roman.
Yeah, it would become this. It's a lot of this. It's basically Romans have a Roman religion.
Right. And the Chinese have Chinese religion.
Yeah. The easiest way to think of this is probably Europe, where I think the kind of Christian spread across Europe. There are obvious exceptions, Spain, Sicily, but almost all of Europe has become pretty Christian and really at the kind of 900, 1000.
You have conversions of kings, right? the king converts first, and then a couple of centuries before all of their subjects convert.
But the monks are coming.
Right. And they work for the kings. There's a Christian bureaucracy. The monks are so and the Islamic world, the Abbasid Caliphate is big, but you start to have places when it breaks apart around 945 is the conventional date for where there's no longer being politically unified. And you have, I wrote a little bit about these dynasties like the Samanids in Central Asia, right?
And Islam is on the Chinese borders around this time.
Yeah.
It starts to come to areas like modern-day Xinjiang around this time.
Right. And Islam is spreading, within Africa. It's been on the East African coast, but it's spreading from the north down through the Sahara, south through the Sahara.
And Hindu origins, they go really, really deep, of course, in the classical Brahmanic way, but the proper Hindu revival that is, I think, often, at least in the textbooks, taught as a kind of a response to Buddhism, especially, that happens, I don't know exactly when that should be dated, but definitely between year 1 and year 1000.
I'm deeply influenced by a former colleague of mine named Richard Davis, who called the ancient Indian religion Vedic and then distinguished between Vedic and Hindu. And I think that's a helpful way to think about it. But, Buddhism is dying out in India, just as it's not, it's moving into China, but it's taking off in China, Japan, Korea, the Liao.
What about Southeast Asia?
Oh, and Southeast Asia is kind of mixed. And certain places like, Cambodia, one king is Buddhist and one king is Hindu, or one king is both.
Yeah. But that's kind of what Southeast Asia is. It's a very mixed place still today. So,
yeah.
And I guess Islam comes a little bit later, so that doesn't fit so well into this story to Southeast Asia. But yeah, I really like the idea of obviously the map is not so clean. Obviously there are not clear colors. You can just color the whole map in like 4 colors. But it starts to make sense as an exercise to go through the world in this kind of 3 minutes. Let's go through the world in terms of these couple of religions. And it does not make sense really before this period.
Yes, I think that's true. And I was going to say one thing in terms of the legitimacy of the categories is that the historical actors at the time are using them.
Interesting.
Right. So that we're not superimposing this on people.
What are they using?
Well, I'm thinking about and I write about this, but the most famous person is he starts life as a non-Christian. He's worshiping whatever local deities there are in modern day Ukraine, named Vladimir. And then when he succeeds in unifying the Rus, then kind of looks around and says, we need something that everyone will unify everybody. Let's pick a religion. And he sends, according to a slightly later source called the Primary Chronicle, he sends teams out to look at different religions. And, he likes to drink, so he just rules out Islam to start with. It's like, it's like out of the question, they don't drink. And then the Jews are interesting because they have the Khazars in Central Asia. At least some of them, their rulers are Jewish. And they, allegedly a delegation comes to him and says, you should convert to Judaism. And he says, you guys don't control Jerusalem. Like you can't, if you don't control Jerusalem, you're not controlling the center of your religion. You're out, so he rejects them. And then, he gets down to basically the church, the Roman church, which I think technically we shouldn't call Catholic yet, but a proto-Catholic church, and then Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And he sends the team out, and then the story goes that they see Hagia Sophia and come back and say, okay,
this is it.
Like, there's no question.
This is the real deal.
These people, this is the real deal.
Wow.
Right.
And most of Eastern Europe is Orthodox.
Right. Still that way.
Still today.
And that's something when you talk about globalization, that people who stay home, and let's say people who don't have much money, so they're not buying imported goods or very many imported goods, but they're certainly affected by these new religions coming into where they have lived. So that's where I think the year 1000, you can make a case for globalization beginning.
I think that's a good place to start coming to an end. So as my final question is, how has all your work shaped your outlook on humanity?
Well, the main thing I think about this is writing about all the people that I write about. that, they live in a different world than us, right, in terms of medicine and computers, TVs. But so many of the things they do seem so human to me. And one time I was giving a talk once time to my colleagues and talking about Chinese workers. This is right, so it's like 1100, and they're in the Chinese capital. It's Kaifeng. And they go to the market, and at the market, there was a sugarcane juice vendor, and he sold sugarcane juice, but he also sold musk flavored sugarcane juice. So, and musk is there's a musk deer that lives in Tibet, and there's a special, it's funny, it looks like a testicle. It's not a testicle, but it looks like a sexual organ. And then, if you kill the animal, or maybe you could remove the pod without killing the animal, and you cut it in half, it has this substance in it that extends the life of perfume. It's a lot like ambergris. So anyway, these peasant workers could buy sugarcane that had been flavored, had been steamed in musk smoke. And I was talking to my colleagues about this, and I said, I just don't really understand this, because, like, why wouldn't you just have the sugarcane? Why does it have to taste like musk? And my colleague, Paul Friedman, who's written a lot about food and about spices in medieval Europe, he said to me, it's like, Valerie, you don't understand anything. He said, think about going to Starbucks, and for 50 cents, you can have your coffee taste like pumpkin. It's exactly the same thing. And, and you just you have a better day because your coffee had tasted like pumpkin. And these poor laborers, whatever they were building in the Sung capital, they have a better day because the sugarcane that they were chewing on had been steamed in musk flavor. And so, that desire for new experiences, eating something new, maybe buying something small you can put in your house, I just think that's like a fundamental human quality. And it's really been a driving force really throughout human history. And then you can really see its impact in the year 1000.
Valerie Hansen, thank you so much for your work and your time today.
Thank you so much, Ilaria. It was really fun.
Okay, so that was it for today. Thank you for sticking with us until the very end. You can find more topics about the making of the modern world in the past episodes on the On Humans feed. If you're new to the show, do check them out. And if you enjoy this, then you can support the show for free by giving us by sharing this episode, and by giving the show a nice 5-star review if you think that it deserves it. And of course, you can head to patreon.com/onhumans if you want to pledge a small monetary amount every month to keep the show running. But hey, this was it for today. Until next time, take care.